The mountain stands above the surrounding terrain like a plateau lifted into the sky. At 11,700 feet, the air thins enough that movement becomes deliberate. Breathing is slower. Sound carries farther, then fades more quickly. The temperature changes without warning. Shade holds cold. Sunlight warms only the surface. This elevation is not an extreme summit. There are higher places in the world, and more dangerous ones. But the conditions here are quiet in a way that can mislead. The environment feels stable. Snow lines sit above the ridges, and below them, the ground remains exposed for much of the year. Wind shapes the vegetation into low, flattened forms. Trees appear smaller and spaced farther apart. Trails exist, but they are not always marked. Weather can shift from clear to opaque in minutes. Fog erases distance. Cloud cover hides landmarks. At this altitude, errors do not need to be large to become permanent. There is no sense of urgency here at first. The mountain does not announce risk. It allows time. It offers wide views and slow gradients. The danger comes later, not from the height itself, but from the isolation that grows unnoticed once direction is lost. The person who would become lost at this elevation was not inexperienced. They were not attempting a first ascent or an experimental route. The journey took place on a well-known mountain in California's Sierra Nevada range, an area with established trails, seasonal foot traffic, and a long history of recreational climbing. The individual was an adult solo hiker and climber. Their background included multiple years of experience in high-altitude environments. They were physically fit and accustomed to navigating without constant visual markers. This was not an impulsive trip. It was planned as a short, routine ascent with a defined return window. The mountain itself was Mount Whitney, the highest point in the contiguous United States, rising to 14,505 feet. The incident occurred below the summit, at approximately 11,700 feet, on a section of terrain that sits between the main trail and several side routes used by climbers attempting faster or less crowded approaches. At the time of the incident, the climber carried standard equipment for a day ascent: water, layered clothing, food, a headlamp, and basic navigation tools. There was no satellite beacon. Cellular reception in the area was inconsistent and dependent on line of sight to lower valleys. The weather forecast predicted stable conditions. No storm warnings were active. Snow was present in shaded areas, but not on the main trail. Visibility during the initial ascent was clear. The purpose of the climb was not a record attempt or guided expedition. It was a personal outing, undertaken alone, during a period of low seasonal traffic. Fewer people were on the mountain than during peak summer months. Some sections of the trail were empty for hours at a time. Solo climbs of Whitney are common and generally considered manageable for experienced hikers. Rescue infrastructure exists, but response time depends on reports from other climbers. Without an external signal, a person off-route may not be noticed for days. This context matters because it removes the expectation of immediate danger. The individual was not taking exceptional risks. They were following a familiar pattern in a controlled environment. The loss did not occur because of recklessness, but because a series of small decisions intersected with terrain that does not tolerate error. The deviation began without urgency. At approximately 11,700 feet, the main trail curves across a broad slope of exposed rock and compacted soil. Several informal paths branch off toward steeper ground. These routes are not officially maintained, but they are visible enough to appear legitimate, especially in low traffic conditions when footprints and trail wear blend together. The climber left the primary route to investigate one of these side paths. The intention was to bypass a longer section of switchbacks and rejoin the trail higher up. This type of shortcut is common among experienced hikers and usually successful in clear conditions. Within minutes, the slope steepened. The terrain shifted from packed trail to loose granite and shallow gullies. Progress slowed. The surrounding ridgelines remained visible, but the exact position relative to the main trail became uncertain. At this altitude, small changes in direction have amplified consequences. The mountain's surface is folded into shallow basins that channel movement downward without clear exits. Once inside, returning uphill requires more energy than continuing forward. The climber attempted to regain the original route but encountered a series of rock faces that were difficult to ascend without technical equipment. The choice was made to continue laterally, searching for a safer traverse. This was the point of no return. The main trail, still less than a mile away in straight-line distance, was now separated by a series of steep drops and broken ridges. Visibility remained acceptable, but the terrain no longer allowed simple backtracking. There was no immediate threat. No injury had occurred. No storm was visible. But the situation had shifted from navigation to containment. Movement was now constrained by the landscape rather than controlled by choice. The mountain had not changed. The route had. The first priority was not shelter. It was position. The climber remained on open terrain, moving slowly across the slope in an attempt to locate a path that would reconnect with the main route. At 11,700 feet, the body consumes energy at a higher rate. Oxygen intake is reduced. Muscles fatigue more quickly. Each movement requires attention. The surrounding landscape offered few clear reference points. The mountain's upper slopes are composed of repeating forms, angled rock fields, shallow ravines, and scattered boulders of similar color and size. From ground level, these features appear interchangeable. Distance is difficult to judge. A ridge that looks close may take hours to reach. The climber continued traversing for the remainder of the daylight hours. Several attempts were made to climb back toward higher ground, but the rock faces became steeper and more fractured. Without ropes or climbing protection, the risk of a fall increased with each attempt. The decision was made to descend slightly and seek a more gradual route. This pattern repeated. Upward movement was blocked. Lateral movement led to further isolation. Descending reduced immediate physical risk but increased distance from known trails. By evening, the climber had covered several miles of uneven ground without regaining the main route. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset. Wind increased. Visibility collapsed to a narrow range defined by the headlamp beam. Shelter became necessary. There were no constructed shelters in this area of the mountain. The climber located a shallow rock overhang that provided minimal protection from wind. It was not enclosed, but it reduced exposure. Clothing layers were added. Food and water were rationed. Sleep was fragmented. The following morning, the landscape appeared unfamiliar despite having been crossed the day before. Without prominent landmarks, the environment offered no sense of progress or return. The climber attempted to establish a consistent direction of travel based on the sun's position and general topography. Movement was now slower. Fatigue accumulated. The terrain demanded constant balance. Loose rocks shifted underfoot. Slopes angled just enough to require careful foot placement. Water became a limiting factor. At this altitude, natural water sources are rare and seasonal. Snow patches existed in shaded areas, but they were distant and required additional energy to reach. The climber conserved remaining water, reducing intake to slow dehydration. Food was still available, but appetite decreased. The body prioritized basic function over digestion. Energy levels dropped. Over the next 2 days, the climber continued moving during daylight and resting at night in exposed positions. No human activity was visible. No aircraft were seen. Sound did not carry upward from lower valleys. Attempts to use a mobile phone failed. There was no reception. The device was powered down to conserve battery. The environment imposed a rhythm that was independent of intention. Daylight allowed movement. Darkness forced stillness. Weather shifted without notice. Wind gusts increased. Clouds formed along the ridges and dissolved again. The climber began to limit movement to avoid further exhaustion. Instead of continuous travel, short reconnaissance attempts were made from temporary resting points. Each ended in similar terrain, steep drops, broken ridges, no visible trail. Psychological pressure increased, not through fear, but through repetition. The mountain offered the same view in every direction. There were no signs of change. By the fourth day, physical condition had deteriorated. Dehydration caused dizziness. Headaches became persistent. Muscle cramps appeared during movement. The climber's pace slowed further. The decision was made to remain in a single location rather than continue moving blindly. The chosen site was a small basin between rock formations that provided partial shelter from wind. Snow was visible nearby and could be melted for water using body heat and sunlight. This marked a shift from navigation to survival. Daily routine became simple and constrained. Collect snow. Conserve energy. Remain visible from above. Rest as much as possible. Avoid unnecessary movement. Time lost precision. Without external reference, days were measured by sunlight cycles and physical decline. The climber tracked time loosely by counting nights spent in the basin. Food supplies diminished steadily. Rations were reduced. Physical activity decreased to preserve calories. The body entered a state of energy conservation. Mental strategies became practical rather than emotional. The climber avoided speculation about outcomes. Attention remained focused on immediate tasks, hydration, warmth, limited movement to prevent stiffness. At altitude, prolonged inactivity creates its own risks. Muscles weaken. Circulation slows. Cold exposure increases. But movement required energy that was no longer available. The mountain did not change. It continued to provide cold air, shifting clouds, and empty space. The environment remained indifferent to the human presence within it. Survival became a matter of maintaining minimal function. Breathing. Staying conscious. Preserving heat. Waiting. By the end of the first week, the climber's physical condition had entered a measurable decline. Dehydration was no longer controlled. Snow collection required more effort than the body could reliably produce. Melting it using ambient warmth was slow and inefficient. Intake dropped below what was necessary to maintain circulation and cognitive clarity. Headaches became constant. Vision blurred intermittently. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. The remaining portions were small and infrequent. Without sufficient calories, the body shifted to metabolizing stored fat and muscle. Strength diminished rapidly. Standing for extended periods became difficult. Balance deteriorated. Cold exposure compounded these effects. Even during daylight, temperatures remained low. Wind penetrated clothing layers. Sleep was shallow and frequently interrupted by shivering. The body could not fully recover between periods of wakefulness. Cognitive function began to change. Decision-making slowed. Attention narrowed to immediate sensations. The climber experienced difficulty maintaining orientation, even within the small basin that had become a stationary shelter. Attempts to signal for help were limited by physical weakness. No signal mirror or flare was available. The headlamp battery was conserved for emergencies and eventually failed. Without light, movement after sunset became impossible. The body's adaptive mechanisms, effective during the initial days, began to fail under sustained stress. Muscle cramps increased. Hands lost dexterity. Fine motor control disappeared. Simple tasks required multiple attempts. The climber remained visible from above, but only in theory. Aircraft flight paths did not pass directly overhead. Rescue operations in this region depend on reported disappearances and approximate last known locations. No report had yet been filed. As physical condition worsened, the climber spent more time lying down to conserve energy. This reduced heat loss but also accelerated muscle atrophy. Standing became painful. Walking became limited to short, unstable movements. Psychological strain increased, but it manifested as detachment rather than panic. The environment remained unchanged. The mountain offered no new information, no variation, no sign of external activity. Time perception distorted further. Days blended. The distinction between morning and evening weakened. The climber's focus narrowed to physical sensations, cold, thirst, pressure in the head. By the 10th day, the climber could no longer travel meaningful distance. Survival had shifted from active maintenance to passive endurance. The body was no longer adapting. It was deteriorating. The mountain remained silent. Shall I continue with the next chapter? The disappearance was formally reported after the climber failed to return within the expected time frame. Search and rescue operations began with the established routes on Mount Whitney. Teams followed the main trail and surrounding areas, using ground patrols and aerial surveys. The initial focus remained on likely paths rather than remote basins. Weather conditions limited visibility. Cloud cover restricted helicopter access during critical early windows. Ground teams covered wide areas but were constrained by terrain and available daylight. The climber's location, several miles off the main route and below a series of broken ridges, did not fall within the initial search perimeter. No signals had been detected. No personal equipment had been found. After nearly 2 weeks, an aerial survey identified a stationary figure in a shallow rock basin at approximately 11,700 feet. The body was visible against the pale granite, partially covered by clothing and snow residue. Rescue teams reached the site later that day. The climber was found deceased. The cause of death was attributed to exposure and dehydration. There were no signs of trauma. No evidence of a fall or injury. The body position indicated prolonged immobility. Personal belongings confirmed identity. The mobile phone was found powered off. Food supplies were depleted. There was no emergency signaling equipment. Recovery required technical access due to steep surrounding terrain. The body was transported down the mountain by ground team over several hours. The official report concluded that the climber became lost after leaving the main trail and was unable to regain it. Without external communication or timely discovery, survival beyond the first week became unlikely. There was no indication of reckless behavior. No violation of safety protocols. The incident was classified as an off-route navigation failure in high-altitude terrain. The mountain returned to normal conditions within days. Foot traffic resumed. Weather stabilized. The basin remained unchanged. The incident did not alter established climbing practices on Mount Whitney. Trails remained open. Access policies were unchanged. The mountain continued to receive thousands of visitors each year. No permanent marker was placed at the site. The basin where the climber was found remained unnamed. It was not included in official maps or trail guides. From above, it appeared identical to countless other depressions scattered across the upper slopes. In rescue documentation, the case is categorized alongside similar incidents, experienced individuals lost after minor route deviations in high-altitude terrain. These cases share common features. Clear weather. Familiar environments. Small decisions with cumulative consequences. The mountain itself is not unusually dangerous. It does not require technical climbing on standard routes. Fatality rates remain low relative to visitor numbers. Most incidents result from navigation errors rather than environmental extremes. What distinguishes this case is not the terrain, but the absence of immediate feedback. The climber did not fall. There was no sudden injury. There was only gradual isolation in a landscape that does not provide reference points once direction is lost. Survival depended not on strength or skill, but on the chance of being seen. Without a signal, without movement across known paths, visibility became the limiting factor. The environment did not act. It remained constant. It did not intervene. It did not conceal. It simply existed. The mountain continues to hold space where human presence can vanish without disruption. At altitude, scale becomes abstract. Distance expands. Sound fades. Movement slows. Nothing marks the location now. The terrain offers no indication that a person once waited there. Only the record remains.